I'm an investigator, I follow the evidence. So if evidence comes in that's gonna steer me in a different direction, I will 100% look at it and totally could change my mind. But now, as of this point in time, I feel confident that I know who killed Rebekah. In 2004, a 22-year-old college student named Rebekah Gould was brutally murdered near Melbourne, Arkansas. My sister was friends with Rebekah's sister, and that's what initially pulled me into the case. And the case has been cold for the last 15 years, almost. Over the years, I know that police have looked at a number of different people, but no one's ever been arrested or charged. The first season of Hell & Gone was an emotional roller coaster, for which I may never recover. I mean, there were days when I felt really scared. There were days when I felt nothing was ever gonna happen, and it was very isolating. But then when I had the investigator tell me, I'm not trying to be patronizing, but investigations are grown-up stuff, then that just made me really determined to fight. I think the most satisfying part was realizing that we did overcome that. We weren't silenced, we weren't shut down, we did get her story out there. We've brought, I believe, some element of renewed hope to her family, and we had a real part in helping find answers for this family. My goal for Hell & Gone really was to tell Rebekah's story. I always focus on victimology, and I always focus on telling the victim story. A lot of true crime shows and podcasts focus on more the criminal mind, and I love those shows, I watch all of them. But for me, it's more about who was the victim, what were they doing? Because piecing that together is really important to figuring out who did it. I really want to solve the murder, and I want to get justice for Rebekah. That's the ultimate goal. But the most important thing to me was telling her story, getting it out there, and doing what we could do to close the case. The podcast ended up being the perfect way to tell the story because you can really take a deep dive into the case. You can spend time on the ground. Also, I think the fact that we did not have cameras there really helped us when we were talking to these people. We're talking to people about what they were doing on the day someone was murdered. And building that trust, I just don't think it would have been the same dynamic if we'd had a camera. Being on the ground in Arkansas made the case because we had to spend the time there in order to get to know people. I had to basically move there. I was supposed to be there for 2 weeks, ended up staying for almost 6 months, and building that trust was key. And often it would have to be, I would be talking to someone and they would then introduce me to their friend, and then I'd get pulled into the next person. And that dynamic couldn't have happened if I hadn't lived there, known what was going on in the community, known what the dynamics were between all these people. Since the beginning, it's been really obvious that the police were not going to give us any information. And I do totally understand that in an open investigation, police have to hold back certain things, and so I get that. But, it's been almost 15 years at this point. Until the correct person is arrested and charged and brought to justice, there's always more information you can find. That was one of the things that frustrated me about the police approach in the beginning, because they seemed to be taking the approach of, well, we've kind of done what we can, we don't really have enough, so we're just gonna stop. And that's not a stopping point. The stopping point is you either get more if you feel confident you know who did it, or you go back to the beginning, look at it again. And I think there are a lot of questions that can be answered, like, we need to find out where everyone was on that day. We eventually began to suspect that the person who did this was someone the police ruled out, and we really began to focus on that. We also found witnesses that no one had found before, pieces of information that have now been added to the case file that no one had found before. In addition, we were able to ask some questions about where certain people were on the day Rebekah was murdered. And we'd been told that's been resolved, we know all this, but actually it turns out it wasn't. And so we're still digging for information, and we've been working since the podcast ended. I've already been back to Arkansas twice, but I do think that we'll have to stay longer, spend a more significant amount of time on the ground. I'm not done until the right person gets arrested. It's not finished yet. I think bringing national attention to this story is really important. First of all, for Rebekah, for Rebekah's family and friends to get justice, but also this is unfortunately a story that replicates itself probably in a lot of small towns across America. You have law enforcement, and a lot of them are fantastic, but sometimes when one person is in charge for so long and they won't let a fresh pair of eyes look at the case, it can be difficult. They just maintain an absolute hold on the information. It's just unfortunate because when that happens, it's your family member and you're trying to find out what happened to them, and there's no transparency. 40 to 50% of murders in this country are unsolved. And I get so many emails and texts every day from people begging for help, begging for someone to take a look at their family member's case. And the fact of the matter is, unless you do get these stories out there, in a lot of these little towns, law enforcement are operating in this atmosphere of total secrecy, and no one's gonna know what's going on. Since last season, myself and one of the podcast producers met with the Arkansas State legislator, and basically we discussed the possibility of helping research Rebekah's Law, which would be something that would allow more open access to cold case files. It's something that would have to go through a long review process because you have to make sure that you don't release information too soon. You want to be able to have successful prosecutions. What we want to stop is one person from having absolute control over this for decades. For the most part, people have been really supportive, and I am so grateful to everyone who's listened, told a friend, sent a tip. To me, crowdsourcing is a really crucial part of solving cases now, and you can't ignore it. So many people feel comfortable talking on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook. Even if they don't feel comfortable calling or texting, they might feel comfortable sending the information that way. Of course, there are always going to be people who are critical. Some of Rebekah's other family members, they don't love the podcast. They've made it clear. I hate that, but at the same time, people grieve in different ways. People handle things in different ways. I decided early on in this investigation that it didn't matter what anyone said. I wanted to get as many people on board as I could, but I was doing this to Rebekah, so I was just gonna keep going no matter what. And Helen Gone exceeded my wildest expectations. It was exhilarating. It was also really scary, to be honest, because people were talking about the case and saying, aren't you afraid for your life? And I mean, I never got any threats like that, but I definitely felt the sense of danger every time I went out to interview someone, because you never know if it's gonna be the killer, someone who's friends with the killer. I went in there thinking, I'd love to solve this, I want to solve it, I think I can. And what ended up happening was we got a ton of new information. We turned the whole case around. We got people talking about it. We have millions of people who know about Rebekah's story and are following it and want to help. And we just need them to keep on with us, because we're not stopping, we're not giving up. We just have to keep going and get justice for Rebekah.